The snowstorm raged outside, its icy winds violently battering the walls of Thierry's cabin. Inside, the former firefighter sat in his living room, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows around him. The blizzard had isolated him for several days, and the silence was only broken by the occasional crackling of logs in the fire. Then a noise shattered the stillness, a faint, desperate scratching. Thierry frowned and put down his coffee cup. He strained his ears. He heard it again, this time accompanied by a muffled whimper. His heart raced. The sound was coming from the front door. Rising abruptly, he moved toward the door, his mind racing with questions. When he leaned to look through the frosted glass, he saw a trembling silhouette, a German shepherd accompanied by 2 puppies. They were freezing, struggling against the biting cold. The sound came again, a desperate scratching followed by a faint whimper. Thierry's heart pounded as he approached the front door. The wind howled outside, but this fragile, piercing sound came from just beyond. He stood up abruptly, cautiously making his way to the door. As he neared the fogged glass, his eyes locked onto the silhouette barely visible through the storm. There, standing in the snow, was a German shepherd, her coat trembling under the assault of the cold. Her eyes, filled with immeasurable distress, gazed at him through the glass. Near her, 2 puppies shivered, almost invisible, huddled against her in a desperate attempt for warmth. Ice clung to their fur, while the mother, protective and still, seemed frozen, watching Thierry's every move. The scene was heart-wrenching, and without further hesitation Thierry reached for the handle, his heart heavy with concern. His breath formed visible clouds in the freezing air, each exhalation a sign of his battle against the merciless cold. She didn't take her eyes off Thierry, her gaze a mixture of deep distress and a flicker of hope. Thierry hesitated, doubt momentarily paralyzing him, his hand hovering above the handle. He knew that every action, every decision carried consequences, and opening this door could lead to unforeseen complications. Yet the intensity of her gaze, that glimmer of trust mixed with fear, stirred an irresistible impulse within him. This dog wasn't merely a lost animal, she was a being in distress, pleading for help. Time seemed to freeze. The wind howled behind her, snow swirling in chaotic waves as her posture remained motionless, protective of the puppies clinging to her side. One of them trembled so violently that Thierry could almost feel its fear through the glass. The urgency was palpable, and without further thought he slowly turned the handle. Thierry observed the dog, her thin body, ribs visible under her ragged fur, and a layer of crystalline ice clinging to her coat. Her eyes, wide and pleading, met his, a mixture of terror and hope in their depths. "What happened to you?" Thierry murmured, his voice soft and broken by the room's cold. A heavy silence stretched as he stepped closer. Compassion, powerful and irresistible, urged him toward the door. When he turned the handle, a sharp crack echoed, immediately followed by an icy gust that swept into the cabin, sending a chill through the room. The dog didn't move. She stood there, frozen in the snow, her paws anchored to the icy ground. Her eyes stayed fixed on Thierry, tracking his every move, silent hesitation creeping into her gaze. "Come on, come in." Thierry lowered his voice, speaking gently. "You'll freeze to death out here." The dog let out a faint whimper, her gaze briefly flickering to her puppies as if ensuring they were following. Slowly she took a step forward, her body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. A gentle nudge to the nearest puppy seemed to give it the signal to move. The little one, still unsteady, fell into the snow, its slippery legs struggling to follow. The dog, without hesitation, gently picked it up by the scruff of its neck, carrying it in her mouth to protect it. The other puppy hurried after her. As soon as they passed through the doorway, Thierry quickly shut the door, sealing them off from the storm's chaos. The sudden warmth filled the cabin, and the dog shivered violently, her body reacting to the stark contrast as she curled up against her puppies, seeking comfort. Thierry stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the mother and her pups, his heart heavy with the fragility of the situation. He had witnessed lives saved in far harsher conditions, but this scene of abandonment and survival deeply moved him. Slowly he straightened, giving the canine family space. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, providing a welcome warmth, though tension lingered in the air. The dog, though more relaxed, kept a vigilant eye on Thierry, her ears twitching with every movement. Her puppies, however, seemed to find comfort in the warmth, their breathing calming, less labored. Thierry knew he couldn't leave them like this. He turned toward the door, considering what he could do to help. Shelter, food, care. He had made a decision, but a new question haunted him. What if the storm didn't relent? Thierry felt caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that sometimes life presented inexplicable challenges, but this, the dog and her puppies, seemed beyond anything he had imagined. He wondered if someone was searching for them or if this dog was simply another unfortunate lone traveler caught in the storm. Loneliness, he knew it well. But here in this isolated cabin he felt an unusual connection. Perhaps he had more to offer than warmth and food. Perhaps he was meant to be the link that would allow this animal family to survive, just as he had survived his own struggles. The warmth of the fire and the sight of the puppies slowly drifting off to sleep reminded him of life's fragility, of how he often felt like a survivor in his own world. He rose to fetch extra blankets, ready to provide more warmth and security to these vulnerable beings. Thierry stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the dog and her puppies, who, despite their vulnerability, seemed to carry an invisible strength within them. The storm still raged outside, but within the warmth of the cabin he felt a strange sense of solidarity. He wasn't sure what to do or even what he could offer, but he knew he couldn't just let them go. Walking over to the cupboard, he took out some of the provisions he had stored. The idea of providing them with food brought him some reassurance. Perhaps tomorrow he would find a solution. Perhaps. But for now he wasn't ready to abandon them to their fate. He settled in a corner of the room, observing the dog, his head tilted slightly. This wasn't the kind of change he had imagined for his retirement, but he realized that sometimes life had its own plans. And tonight he wasn't alone. As the days passed, Thierry grew accustomed to the presence of the three animals. The German shepherd and her puppies seemed to begin understanding that they were safe here. The dog grew calmer, her eyes, once filled with distrust, now holding a timid trust. She would lie near the fire each evening, her puppies nestled against her. Thierry, meanwhile, felt increasingly invested in their well-being, as though this unplanned act of kindness had brought a new sense of purpose to his life. He adjusted his routine to accommodate them, ensuring they had warm food, cleaning the cabin and maintaining the heat despite the storm still raging outside. He hadn't expected this, but he didn't regret it. The presence of these animals, their fragility and resilience, awakened in him a newfound connection to life, as though rediscovering a forgotten purpose. Thierry rose slowly, careful not to disturb the tranquility in the room. He didn't want to disrupt the peaceful moment. Moving to the window, he gazed outside at the snow-covered landscape. The freshly fallen snow blanketed everything in white. The air was crisp and the scent of cold filled his nostrils. For a moment he felt almost at peace, as though the world around him had slowed down, suspended in the calm morning after the storm. His gaze returned to the dog and her pups. He hadn't planned to become their guardian, but he knew he couldn't abandon them. They were fragile, and so was he, in his own way. The dog seemed more at ease now, and Thierry found himself smiling, warmth flooding his chest. He took a deep breath and headed to the kitchen to prepare food for everyone, feeling strangely connected to them, like a newfound family he had never expected. Thierry watched the scene in silence, a faint smile on his lips. He would never have imagined his life taking such a turn. The soft clinking of the puppies eagerly eating their meal contrasted with the cold, harsh world outside, and for a moment, everything seemed right. After a few bites, the dog lifted her eyes to meet his. Her gaze, still watchful and protective, carried a hint of newfound calm. Thierry crouched slowly, his movements gentle and non-threatening, and murmured, "You'll see, everything will be fine." Returning to the window, he let the dog and her puppies eat in peace. Outside, the snow seemed less menacing, the sky gradually clearing. It was as if the storm had been a shared trial, a moment of transition that, though uncertain, had brought him closer to this fragile yet courageous little group. Thierry felt ready to face whatever came next with them. He now had a new responsibility but also a new bond. He stood slowly, a newfound determination in his gaze. He knew he couldn't leave them like this. He had to do more for them. The cold seeped into his bones, but he ignored it. The situation demanded action, not hesitation. Thierry walked over to the closet and pulled out an old blanket, carefully spreading it near the fireplace. He then headed to the kitchen to prepare something more nourishing for the mother and her pups, searching through his supplies for heartier ingredients. As the food warmed, he turned to the dog. "You're not alone here, you know," he said softly, his voice gentle but resolute. His gestures were filled with respect for this dog who had survived so much. In return, Thierry wanted to be a support for her and her pups. The firelight danced on the walls, but it was his own inner warmth that gave him the strength to continue. Though reassured by the warmth and food, Thierry couldn't shake the lingering worry. The nearby veterinary clinic offered hope, but he wondered if it would be enough. The mother and her pups had already endured so much. After some thought, he prepared an old pet carrier and did his best to ready them for the journey. The dog, though still cautious, accepted the bowl of soup he placed before her without resistance. He observed the puppies, one of whom seemed particularly frail, its tiny legs trembling with each move. Thierry frowned. He had to act quickly before the condition of one of them worsened. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the door, the dog and her pups by his side. Outside, the snow was a blank canvas, but the unknown awaiting them at the clinic was just as daunting. The drive to the veterinary clinic was heavy with silence. Thierry occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror at the dog, who curled protectively around her pups, seemingly soothed by the warmth of the vehicle. Yet he could still sense the tension in her muscles, the vigilance in her eyes. He understood her wariness. She had fought to survive and protect her young. Arriving at the clinic, Thierry carefully helped the dog and her pups out of the truck. A veterinarian greeted him promptly, offering reassuring words while examining the animals. Thierry listened intently to the assessments, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. "They were lucky to be found in time," explained the veterinarian, gently stroking the puppies. "But they'll need treatment to recover." Thierry nodded, a heavy weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew this was just the beginning, but he had done the right thing. And that mattered. Dr. Martin continued his examination carefully, taking notes in his file while explaining the steps needed to help the dog recover. Thierry listened attentively, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Where were her owners? Why had this dog been abandoned? A nurse arrived with medications and nutritional supplements, which she began administering to the mother and her pups. Thierry watched, feeling deeply grateful to this dedicated team who were giving the animals a chance at recovery that he wouldn't have been able to provide alone. Dr. Martin turned back to Thierry. "We'll keep them here for a few days. We have the resources to treat them and monitor their condition." Thierry nodded again, relieved yet anxious. He had never imagined that his quiet daily life would be upended by such an event. But one thing was certain. He would do everything necessary to give these animals the hope they deserved. He sat there for a long time, silently watching the dog and her little ones. The warmth of the room and the tenderness of the moment contrasted with the intensity of the days spent outside in the snow and wind. Grace had chosen this refuge, and despite everything she had endured, she was ready to trust him. The puppies, their eyes barely open, moved feebly, their tiny tails wagging enthusiastically whenever their mother shifted. Thierry watched with amazement as the dog tenderly groomed them, her maternal instinct palpable in every movement. Finally, he got up and went to the kitchen to prepare some food. The quiet of the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire, seemed to mark a new beginning. Thierry knew he had opened a door and that this new adventure was teaching him once again the true strength of living beings. Their ability to heal, to love, and to rebuild. Thierry began to understand the depth of the bond forming between them. Every small step of Grace's progress felt like a victory. He felt privileged to be part of this healing process. The puppies, growing more curious, slowly explored the room, their clumsy little legs carrying them on tiny adventures around the living room. Thierry often watched them with a smile, marveling at how life could be unpredictable yet full of unexpected surprises. He had thought that his life after retirement would be calm with no major changes. But Grace and her puppies had reminded him that even in moments of solitude, there is hope. They were all on this journey together, each in their own way. Every day spent caring for, feeding, and simply being there for them reinforced his conviction that the bonds created in the most unexpected moments were often the strongest. And despite everything he had been through, he now knew he was no longer alone. Grace's eyes shone with a gentleness he hadn't seen in days. Her ears perked up slightly and she let out a small growl as if to express her agreement. Thierry placed his hand on her back, gently stroking her soft fur. He had learned to read Grace's signs, to understand her moods, her needs, and even her fears. "I don't know what you've been through," he murmured, "but you've found your place here. And here you don't have to fight anymore." The crackling of the fire filled the room, and for the first time in a long while, Thierry felt at peace. The presence of Grace, Nedge, and Sandra brought a new warmth to his life, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer alone and he knew it. Perhaps fate had put him on this path for a reason, and in the quiet intimacy of this cabin he embraced this new reality. His thoughts cleared and a sense of belonging settled within him.